All right, good afternoon. You scared me for a moment. I have to do sign language or something. Thanks a lot for that great introduction, Gary. It's a pleasure to be here. You are a brave man telling everybody that I'm a hunter here in Boulder, Colorado, which I think is the home of the National Vegan Society. So it is a pleasure to be here today. And it's a real treat for me. My office is just down the road in Lakewood, Colorado. Most of the events that I get to attend or speak at are in charming places. Like next week I go to Sioux City, Iowa. And for those of you who don't know where Sioux City is, Sioux City, Iowa, it's right next to Sioux City, Nebraska. So I'm sure that's very clear. But I wanted to make sure that to give you kind of a little bit of our background, my background here. We got the slides moving? Or? Oh, perfect. And the pointer. Wow, this is official. Anyway, it is a pleasure to be here. I was in Germany 2 weeks ago, which I'll talk a little bit about, and what's going on in their market. But first, a little bit about the Western Area Power Administration. How many of you have heard of WAPA? I see a customer in the background there. But Western Area Power Administration is actually part of the Department of Energy. I report to the Secretary of Energy. We are one of 4 power marketing administrations. Makes us kind of unique in the utility world in that we take the power from 56 hydro facilities in the western United States, some of which I'm sure you've heard of, like Hoover Dam and Glen Canyon Dam, and some of which you absolutely have not heard of because I can't even remember what they are. We also take about 28.5% of the power out of Navajo Generating Station, at least for another year or so until they close Navajo down for us. And we've got this kind of unique position in the world. We're 15 states. If you think about our footprint, you can see it right there, kind of from Montana all the way out to western Minnesota. We drop down through the corner of Texas, pick up California, but not Oregon, Washington, or Idaho. That's Bonneville Power Administration, one of our sister agencies. The other unique thing about us is we've got 700 customers, such as Delta Montrose, I see in the back. And that ranges everywhere from Los Angeles Department of Water and Power. Is there any LADWP folks here? No, I guess not. To a variety of investor-owned utilities. So when we say customers, it's really municipals, IOUs, co-ops, military bases, those types of folks who get power from the hydro facilities. Now, one of the really unique things about us is we've got 17,000 miles of transmission, which makes us one of the largest transmission entities in the United States. And in fact, the 1.4 million square mile service territory that we have really is among the top 4 in the world. You have to go to a country like India or some other places to actually find a footprint that big. I could bore you with all sorts of statistics. We have 166,000 structures, big transmission towers. But I think the most important thing to remember about us is, in addition to moving the power across these various markets, we buy power every day. We're buying and selling all the time. In a good water year, like this one has been for most of the country, we only buy about $200 million a year. In a dry year, where there's droughts, obviously, we buy about $600 to $700 million a year. So we're very engaged in the markets and what we do. We have 3 fundamental lines of business. The first, as I said, is moving the federal hydropower across 17,000 miles of line. The second is really operating that big transmission grid. We operate in 4 balancing areas, pretty large footprint. And we have 56 facilities in addition, so we're constantly in and out of the market. We've got about 1,500 employees, another 500 or so consultants and contractors that work with us. And last but not least, I've got $3.2 billion for any of you who want to build a transmission line. You're laughing, I'm dead serious, okay? That was given to us by Congress in the Americans Recovery and Reinvestment Act. We've put out about $200 million over time. Plenty of time to still apply for that money. So let me give you my perspective. I've been in the electric utility business about 30 years. I got in here completely by accident. That's a story over a glass of wine later. I spent 8 years at the Electric Power Research Institute. As Gary said, I worked at Central Vermont Public Service. I am proudly a technology nerd. If it's technology in this business, from batteries to meters to what we do on nuclear plants, I love it because of my time at EPRI. I published a book a few years ago, which you're welcome to buy, and I've been involved with utility work, venture capital in the oil, gas, and water business. And last but not least, I want you to understand, for all of my comments, I'm a Doug. I'm a dumb old utility guy, all right? And it's important because that's the perspective that I grew up in this business with, and that's the perspective I will take going forward. And that is, we have to make sure that in this speed and urgency to move to different types of generation, to rearrange markets, that we don't forget the fundamental principles of keeping the lights on. And I know that you may be sitting, well, duh, of course. Well, I can tell you there are folks who don't quite understand that there is a difference between solar and natural gas. There is a difference between nuclear and hydro. There is a difference between wind and storage. So what we all have to do as an industry, and we do every day at WAPA, is to figure out how do we blend those things forward into the new future. Because there's a fundamental change that's happened in the industry. And the challenge for those of us Dougs, and for anybody running an electric piece of this system, is that the perception of what is real and what is real are two very different things. Right? And so what do I mean by that? Well, it's very easy in this day and age to say, well, solar panels and windmills are just fine, thank you. It's just perfect. It's going to take care of the world. Well, I can tell you, we have 25 men and women right now in the U.S. Virgin Islands, along with 4 trucks and a bunch of various equipment to put the grid back together for the U.S. Virgin Islands. And we've got technical experts down supporting the folks in Puerto Rico. I just got photos yesterday, so it's not yet in this presentation, but I can show you how the solar panels really work well in the Virgin Islands. Reality is I can't show you anything because they're all now lighting Davy Jones's locker. Right? So we have to think about these things in a different fashion. We have to make sure that those people who actually understand what goes on in the grid and what's going on in the markets are not making decisions for, quite frankly, lots of the public that could have dire consequences. Now, let me be clear. I support nuclear, I support wind, I support solar, battery storage. We've worked in them all. And when they talk about an all-of-the-above strategy, I think that's critical for anybody in this industry, and certainly as we work in markets, to make sure those markets are functioning properly. So the challenge really is quite interesting. The change is upon us, and I put this slide up here for 2 reasons. One is during March 19th this past year, in the Southwest Power Pool, where we participate for part of our system, wind hit a new penetration record. And if you look at the number, 54.22% of the power being used in SPP, that's kind of in the middle of the country, came from wind. But look at the other number that's up there. What time did that happen? About 1 o'clock in the morning. How much demand do we have at 1 o'clock in the morning? Not a whole heck of a lot. So these kind of numbers and these changes really are, for those of us operating a grid, trying to figure out how do we change our operations and our thinking and our investments to deal with things like 54.22% of wind at 1 o'clock in the morning. Because it's not that simple. Right? It's really a complex puzzle, and data analytics plays a critical role to trying to understand what does the world look like. Let me give you another interesting number. You may have seen this. This comes off the California ISO website. And I realize the dots are pretty small, but you get the idea. The dark blue dots across the grid there, this is right where I guess I have a pointer. Look at that. The dark blue dots, probably easier for me to walk up, are where pricing was negative $50. Okay? The light blue dots are where pricing were below $0. So I ask you the fundamental question, especially if you happen to work for a utility or in the business where you're trying to figure out what do we do to pay for the generation when it's not zero, right? How do we manage in a world where there's below zero pricing? Now, of course, most people say, well, that's great. We can buy all that free stuff we want. But it's not free in the sense that we have to figure out how to keep the grid knit together at a time when pricing is that cheap. Now, again, I will admit, WAPA participates in several markets. We participate in SPP. We trade actively in a CalISO. We are going to announce tomorrow the joining of another big chunk in Colorado, Wyoming, and Arizona, joining a market again. But this is the quandary right here, right? This is a free lunch that somebody is paying us to eat. And we have to figure out how do we get this model to work a little better. I'll give you another example here. This is a Oahe Dam. We have 7 main stem dams on the Missouri River. Kind of great feats of engineering. They are wonderful for 2 reasons. One is they provide great low-cost renewable hydropower, but they also store a lot of water behind them. So before we joined the Southwest Power Pool in 2015, this is what the dispatch of the generating units on Oahe, out of Oahe, looked like. Now you see the sawtooth there, right? That's pretty typical of a hydro resource, or for that matter, a gas plant following wind, right? That's right. So we made some assumptions that, well, when we go into the market with all of our hydro, we're going to make a lot of money. And by that, we're not for profit, but we're going to have enough dollars to keep the system running with ancillary services, VAR support, all the things that keep the grid up and running, right? We did our business plan based on the fact that this was kind of the model that was going to continue. Well, guess what? In October of 2015, we joined the market. This is the same day in 2016. The black line that you're seeing there is showing how our dispatch out of the dam is perfectly straight, right? And you can compare it to what happened the year before. This was a big aha moment for us. Now, the good news is this means the dam doesn't have to cycle up and down. It's a lot better on the equipment, so the capital side of me is really happy. But we completely missed our forecast about using the hydro to chase the wind up and down on the system. But of course, I had people in my office, other Dougs, and what did they tell me? That's just a fluke. It was just until the market gets settled out. This is the same day this year. And you'll note that the tabletop is almost identical. So, of course, when you're trying to plan for your system, what does this mean? And we ask this question all the time. A flat dispatch is really good. What that means is our hydro, which is always low cost, is dispatching like crazy. Our units aren't being worked hard, but it means there's a change in how we have to think and plan and analyze what we're going to buy for the next day. Now, any of you see the Eclipse or part of the Eclipse? Pretty cool, right? This is actually the coolest photo that I have seen of the Eclipse. If you can't see it in the back, see the airplane underneath? That wasn't airbrushed in. That's the actual photo. And so we had a great scientific experiment this year, right? What's going to happen to solar when the eclipse comes? Right? So we were really excited about this because we knew when it's coming and we knew when it's going. So we can do a whole lot of analytics to understand what are the physical system impacts. So as you can imagine, you see the blue bar there. That's the drop in solar generation in California. And by the way, all of these will be posted, these slides, at the WAPA website. I'll tell you where after I'm done talking. Anyway, you see this. So we knew something like this was going to happen. So all of us in the industry are very proactive. Our planning models said, hey, we have to replace this power. And so what did we do? Well, we took 3,200 megawatts from the interties. Those are the valuable transmission lines that hook back and forth across the systems. We zoomed up our hydro in the Central Valley project. We had 800 megawatts. The energy imbalance market had about 350 megawatts. But the good news was, since we knew it was coming, we could plan it, we could see it, we could operate it. We didn't have to do any manual operations on the grid. Great news story, right? But here's an interesting slide. And I realize you can't see some of the numbers, but down the side of the chart here, you'll notice all of these lines, and these are all the solar facilities, the large-scale, utility-scale solar facilities. And you can see the dip, right? It was this, whoops, where we go here? Actually, it was this dip right here. Okay, so what does that look like when you're actually taking a look? That's what it is. But you see that purple or lavender line up there? That's the load in that balancing area. We made the assumption that the load would rise as things got dark. Right? Isn't that intuitively what you would think? People have to turn on the lights, they have to change. But guess what? The load dropped directly in relation to the amount of solar output. Now, we don't know the real answer for this yet. We're doing a lot of studying on this. But the current theory is, because the sun dipped out, air conditioning and HVAC loads dropped. Now, of course, we have some people who say, everybody went to the window to look at the eclipse and turned out their lights. But to me, it's more of an industrial or, kind of a systemic change. So how do you plan for this? I think, and that's really the key for this. How do you plan for this, just like how do you plan for what we saw on the hydro side of the equation? And that's the real challenge for all of us. We are scratching our heads just like everybody in this room and just like everybody in the industry. Now again, a little bit of an eye chart here. I just got this on Friday. PJM is the markets. Any of you in the PJM market? Okay. PJM is the market on the eastern side of the United States, long established, 80 some odd years. But the interesting question was, what do renewables do to the reliability of the system? And the chart up here talks about essential reliability services in that tan color. And how do we maintain things like VAR support, power quality, frequency, in a world where we have more and more and more renewables? And this was kind of an interesting analysis because it shows you that things we don't like anymore, coal, oil, steam, natural gas, and I'm happy to say hydro, are critical for essential reliability services. Right? Now, we get down here, and I want you to really understand, I support 100% of the technologies out there. I told you, I'm a tech nerd. I love batteries. I like it all. But take a look at how do we keep the lights on with demand response or with wind or some of these other pieces. And one of the challenges, I sit on the Western Electric Industry Leaders Forum, and we met last week. We're all going back now in each one of our regions to try to understand, what does this mean? And then if you translate this into economic terms, what does this cost to maintain something for the backbone? And despite what inevitably, when I talk to non-professional audiences about the grid, somebody said, well, batteries are fine. Batteries will take care of it. And I said, well, okay, that's great. I need 10,000 megawatts of battery every day. Right? That's my system. So even if you take the smallest battery container, which is about like a container off a truck, I'd need 10,000 tractor trailers positioned somewhere for some of the day. So there's this darn thing that gets in the way, right? Physics. I know people don't like that. As one of my mentors used to say, electrons follows the laws of physics, electricity follows the laws of politics. And for those of us charged with protecting the grid to make sure the lights stay on, we've got to really look at this and analyze it in a very different fashion. So reliability also changes the way the load shapes work. Right? This is a kind of an interesting analysis DOE just put out. And what it basically shows you is we can shift the peak demand to a different time with these other technologies, but we're not doing something fundamentally different than we have to live with today. As I said, all the stuff will be posted. You can go through it if you've got other questions. The challenge, of course, with variable resources is how do we manage this in this increasingly complex world? And all the markets that we're involved in are doing a good job, but it's almost like they're running to catch up. And part of what we have to understand is, how do these numbers work, and how can we have a little bit of predictability to keep the lights on? Now, I put this slide in here because some people don't like coal. I actually think coal works just fine if you clean it up sufficiently. What you're seeing here are the tranches of retirement of the coal plants across the United States. And it's broken up, both the old stuff that was going to be retired as well as the new stuff that's being retired. And despite what I think some folks say, the reality is natural gas is just kicking coal's ass. I don't, you can talk about various other things, but at the end of the day, the price of natural gas is wiping this out. But the challenge as you look at this, tell me how much solar we can put into New England to take care of all those plant closures, right? It's going to be really challenging. We can certainly do things in California. although they're kind of out on the edge from my perspective, and we operate in California, as to how we're going to manage this in an increasingly complex world. This is really the challenge. The industry's challenge is how do we operate in a world that goes to Twitter for investments that take 30 years. I put this Encyclopedia Britannica up. I grew up, and I don't admit this to everybody, I grew up in New York and New Jersey, and when I was 10 years old, my parents bought me the Encyclopedia Britannica. Right? Fancy leather-bound books, even had our name on the front. And back, so I won't tell you how many years ago, maybe actually almost 50 years ago, they bought this and it was $1,200. Right? I toted that around to my first 4 apartments. It's all bookcases stuff, right? My parents are making an investment that they hoped would last a lifetime. What do we do today? How many of you have an encyclopedia in your house? 1, right? You've probably been toting around as long as I have. So this is the challenge. It's very easy to say we're going to just put in solar, we're going to put in wind, we're going to put in batteries, when we're dealing with an infrastructure that is out over 20, 30, 40, and even 50 years. I just signed contracts for Hoover, right? We call it Boulder Canyon, but you've all been out to Hoover Dam, which extended the contracts for some new folks who had not gotten original Hoover power. I signed 50-year contracts. This is a 150 or 200-year asset. And yet I had folks saying, well, gee, don't do that. Don't use the dams anymore. We'll just take care of it with storage. I'm not sure that that's a viable alternative. And it is the challenge that we all face every single day. Now, I went to Germany 2 weeks ago. How many of you heard that Germany has the answer? Right? That Germany's got it wired. It was really interesting. There were 12 grid operators. We went over there and we met with a lot of the folks in Germany. And in the next week or 2 on our website, I'll have a whole presentation. I just wanted to put one slide up because inevitably people say, well, it's working in Germany. They have this thing called Energiewende, which means the energy turnaround. And the idea there was to convert all of Germany from coal and nuclear to completely to renewables. Now you say, well, what's the big deal? Well, the big deal is that the wholesale price now of renewables has dropped dramatically, but the German consumer is paying 40 cents a kilowatt hour. Right? So again, I give that to you as a number. They fundamentally blew up their entire utility business. Now the good news is that Germany sits where? In the middle of Europe. It's got places like Czechoslovakia and Poland. Guess what their primary generating source is? Coal. They've got the French to the western border. What's their primary source? Nuclear. They got the Scandinavians up north. What do they bring down? Hydro. Right? So they're really lucky that they're in that kind of pocket. They've gone so far as there's 1.8 million owners of generation in Germany. 47% of the renewable generation is owned by the German public. So if you put a panel up. Now all of this sounds great, other than the fact you're trying to figure out how do you balance the system. Of course, I would contend at 40 cents a kilowatt hour, you can do a whole lot. But here's their real big challenge. They need to build 50 billion euros of electric transmission, because guess where all the hydro is and the wind? North Germany. Guess where all the load is? South Germany. All the coal plants, nuclear plants are all in this pocket. You know how easy it is to build a transmission line? It's not. We opened up one in 2015 that was on the drawing boards for 6 years. Took us 2 years to build it, and everybody wanted the line. We had the rights of way, and we had all the access. So what's happening is they're suddenly squeezing the system, and I would contend Germany over time is going to really run into a challenge because of it. Said it was really an eye-opener. The transmission utilities there, which by the way are all owned by foreign companies, which is kind of an interesting dynamic, hate the local distribution utilities, and vice versa. The distribution utilities don't think they need transmission. They have no market per se. They operate using blockchain technology. something new that I learned about, where they're not operating in a centralized market, they're not operating in centralized transmission, so their world is really kind of tumultuous right now. The big lesson, though, and I think this is really important, the big lesson for them was, they call it energy venda, which is energy transformation or energy turnover, and they realized they made a big mistake. What it was electricity turnover. So all of the other components in the German society, particularly transportation and housing, two areas they're going to electrify even more, aren't included in the game. But all the electric consumers are paying for that. So it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out over the next little bit. So what's WAPA doing about it, right? Because that's what I get up and think about every morning. We've tried to change our perspective and our thinking. We have to take a broader perspective to understand what's going on in the market. We joined Southwest Power Pool for the eastern side of the interconnect in 2015. As I said, tomorrow we'll be officially announcing negotiations to move another large chunk of our system, the system that's basically in Colorado, Wyoming, down into Arizona, to look at moving that chunk as well, some of Utah, into the market. And we have to look at this in a very different light. I will tell you personally, and I don't mean to offend anybody, I don't think an electricity market has saved the consumer one penny anywhere in the history of this business. That's not stopping us from having the broader perspective. That's just the nature of the business. So we have to really look at the data and understand exactly how we're going to manage in this new world. And we have to also understand, what are these industry impacts to our customers, right? What is going to happen? I see we've got a friend from Turlock, right? You see what goes on every single day in California, right? So we have to look on a very different fashion. So what I want to do is, I've just mentioned a couple things, and I'd like to leave some time for questions, if that's all right. I want to give you some radical thoughts you can talk about over a glass of wine. These are my thoughts now. This is not an official DOE slide. This is the Mark Gabriel slide, okay? Number one is, I think the kilowatt hour is dead. What do you pay per minute for your cell phone? No clue. We have no idea anymore because everything is bundled and packaged in a way. And I think the longer this industry hangs on the kilowatt hour as a unit of measure, the worse things get, right? Because we've hung all of our investment in capital, we've hung all of our system costs onto something that our customers are using less of. It's a real challenge and a dynamic in this industry. The second thing is, in places like California, remember the blue dots where everything was free or below free? I think we're going to move to an era of all-you-can-eat electricity. Because from 10 to 3 in California, there's a surplus of electricity. So why shouldn't we move to a model which says, hey, if you want to use it from 10 in the morning till 3 in the afternoon, have at it. Use as much as you want. Pay me $59.95 a month. Again, I know that makes some people wig out because of all the work we've done, and I've done personally in energy efficiency and demand response. But it may be the only way to absorb the excess created at the wrong time. I think we're going to move with storage to time of purchase rates, not time of use rates. So here's the analogy. You drive your car, if you're not driving an electric vehicle, or your truck to the gas station, right? You fill it up. That's a time of purchase rate. It's not a time of use rate. It doesn't matter when you use it. It only matters when you buy it. And I believe as we get to different storage capabilities, why wouldn't we? It doesn't matter when you're using it. If I'm buying it at a certain time of day, I don't want people to buy it at 6 p.m. in California, right? I want them to have it when it's 1 o'clock in the afternoon. So this concept that we've had for 30 years about time of use is completely irrelevant when storage becomes the thing. I think the utilities becomes a network provider. Germany is trying to prove that that doesn't work, but I'm 100% convinced that it does work. And if you just, again, the analogy of an AT&T or Verizon or anyone, they're providing the network. Yeah, we hang all our toys off it, but there's the network and the backbone. And I really question this. As a consultant, I did a lot of IRPs. But I'm wondering, when we're all in a market, doesn't the market provide the IRP? Right? And again, that's a philosophical difference in how we have to think. But I could have my own IRP for WAPA. Fortunately, it's easy for me because I'm hydro, right? But I could have an IRP for WAPA, but if I'm buying in the market at the lowest possible cost, what does it matter what my IRP said? I'm going to take what's coming off that market. So it really just changes the world a little bit. Bottom line, from my perspective, change is everywhere. We just have to figure out as an industry, are we going to play, how are we going to play, and what do we have to do to keep the lights on? Because I can assure you, no matter who's promoting other energy sources and dismantling of parts of our business, I mean, you're all aware, right? California now it's got this community aggregation. Sorry, Freudian slip there. No, I've been using that for a while, which could take 80% of the customers away from the incumbent utilities. Germany has already done that. The German model is to break the consumer tie, to completely break the capacity market, and to completely eliminate any real tie of cost to the price of electricity. Right? Things that we think of here, right? Cost causation, economic principles, that's thrown out the window. So that's not too far away. I've got time, I think, for questions. And if you don't want to ask me questions now, you can certainly email me. I said this presentation and others are up at wapa.gov/thesource. You can see all of our materials. In fact, it should be posted within the hour. But with that, happy to answer any questions. It's not that stunning, is it? Thanks. Make me feel guilty here.
No, with 3.2 billion in transmission, that's a big number, and there are a lot of motivation to bring renewables, particularly from rural areas, Wyoming and Utah, down to California. And I think of crossing some of these more rural states in the West is easier than certainly building transmission in California. So I'm wondering, how come WAPA is such a hard time moving forward with the transmission side?
Yeah, it's a great question. Here's the harsh reality. I signed a contract from the wind farm in Wyoming all the way down to basically Hoover Dam area. I signed that a year and a half ago, 2 years ago. The problem is nobody wants to sign up for the offtake. And that's the real challenge. That's what's stopping all these transmission lines. We have the money. I've got the authority. Not that I use it much, but we have eminent domain. It's not the problem of getting the lines sited. I mean, that's a slow part of the process. It's not even the issue, quite frankly, of building the lines. Our crews are phenomenal. Nobody wants to sign the offtake agreements. And the constipation right now in the California market, because of uncertainty, means none of the market players want to commit to buying the power. We've got 7 other projects which we've been trying to get going. Again, we're ready with our permits. We're ready. I've signed the record of decision. We've got the money, but no offtake agreements. And that's what's holding things up. And I do stress over this fact that a couple years ago I testified in front of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission because the question was, gee, what is this going to do to reliability when we close all those coal plants that I showed? And my point was really simple. I can handle that, but if the expectation is when the plant closes, we miraculously build a transmission line to a new renewable resource, that's just not reality. As I said, a line that everybody wanted, we had the rights of way, we had the money, we had the offtake agreements, still took us 8 years. The Trans-West Express line, which is a tremendous project I was talking about going from Wyoming all the way down into Nevada into Southern California, they've been working on that for over 10 years. It's getting people to commit. And in this era of uncertainty, like I showed you, whether it's wind uncertainty, whether it's the natural gas price, we can't seem to break that logjam. Now, there are several lines we're looking at in California. The San Luis Transmission Project goes from San Luis Reservoir all the way up to Northern California. That could happen in 3 or 4 more years. It's been in the works for 3 years. It's just very, very difficult for people to make that commitment to us, and made even more challenging by what could be the loss of customers for the major utilities. It's a great question. Something we wrestle with all the time. Okay, well, and again, I told you I'm a Doug, right? So remember that one. My second day on the job at Central Vermont Public Service 29 some odd years ago, our CEO invited me into his office and he said, Mark, he said, our principle is to keep electricity rates at or below the rate of inflation, right? And so, of course, I'm prejudiced to that thought. But I look at electricity rates in every place that there's a market, and I compare them to places there aren't markets, and I compare the increase or decrease in cost, and in every single case, the market prices are higher. Now, I understand why, right? We delaminated the business. We went from vertically integrated. We now have markets who do a good job, but they have their own sets of overheads. So it drives different behaviors. Again, mind you, we joined a market, we're going to join again, and I'm sure by the end of my tenure at WAPA, we'll be all completely in markets. Not because I love them, but because I think that's just the nature of the industry. But I go market by market, and I look at the prices and ask, you know, would they be at or below the rate of inflation? There was another question there.
Yeah, you touched on it briefly when you were responding to Gary, but given your role, as a BA, but also a government agency, you're not just you individually, but the organization's experience. What kind of role do you see your agency and your sister agencies when kind of setting policy with regard to renewables integration? So, to what degree do you interact with other parts of the DOE on questions like that, given your experience of actually running a system?
Okay, so there's like 3 questions in there, so let me try to unpack them. First, our mission by legislation is to deliver power at the lowest possible cost consistent with sound business principles. Now, many people only want to hear the front half, but we have to follow our business. So I cannot, for example, go out and commit to long-term power from renewables. I'm prohibited from doing so. When I go to buy in the market, I have to buy at the lowest possible cost. That's part of my world. Now, I interact every single day with the Bureau of Land Management, Fish and Wildlife, Forest Service, national parks. We do that, it's part of our business, right? Because our lines go through many parts of the western United States that require us, even to do a repair on a transmission line, they require us to get all those permits. Now, the third part of your question was about the DOE, and we are certainly very engaged with the DOE. For example, our crews that are down in the Virgin Islands, we were able to very quickly, because of relationships with DOE and FEMA, pull trucks and bodies to go down to the islands. We have certainly in the past dealt with a lot of policy questions. I personally am very involved on things like the Electricity Sector Coordinating Council. We just had the Deputy Secretary of Energy at our office last week. So those of us who don't just work a while, but have kind of a lot of a desire to keep the business moving forward, we interact on a regular basis. Now, there are policy things that the Secretary may put out that are not within our ballpark. So on one hand, it's sort of like the movie Aladdin. Remember the movie Aladdin, the cartoon Aladdin? And at one point, Robin Williams jumps up, he says, I'm all powerful in an itty-bitty bottle. And very often, we're kind of in that bottle with the world that we live in. Good question, though.
Talk about markets replacing IRPs. My impression of IRPs is they're sort of a long-term planning tool, and markets are short-term. Could you elaborate on what you meant by that?
Well, you elaborated yourself. That's the challenge, right? So we can develop an IRP, and we do it. So I made a living as a consultant for R.W. Beck and other places doing IRP work. I believe in IRPs. But what's happened in the long-term view is being short-circuited in the Twitter view that a market has, right? It's the same reason we can't build a transmission line. It's hard to do an IRP and look out and say 10 years where we're not sure what the fuel mix is going to be, right? We're all blessed right now with low-cost natural gas. So how do we deal with that in trying to figure out what should the bets be for our customers out in the next 5 or 10 years? It's harder to do an IRP today than it has ever been in my 30 years in the business. Mostly because we don't know, as long as we're connected to a market, what the market is buying and selling is really kind of what we're stuck with. And it's just the nature of the Twitter world. And I don't know how we get around that question. Because we can certainly have a philosophical approach to what we want to do in terms of the environment, in terms of fuel mix, in terms of the economy. But that's all kind of thrown aside when the market is showing me negative $50 pricing. And so that's the push and the pull. I'm not sure if I was running IRP for a utility today, how I would manage that other than to try to project out from the market pricing, kind of layer on a little bit of our social goals and move forward. I mean, I got in this business running demand-side management energy efficiency programs. So you can see how far I've come, for better or for worse. Anyone else?
I was curious why you were so down on the time of use pricing. It seems like with the sort of patterns of solar generation and the ramp in the late afternoon and early evening.
Yeah, I'm not down on time of use. I just think when storage comes in, that's going to be turned around. Because that's what I believe. Look, time of use, absolutely. It's going to have a big impact on it'll have a system-wide impact.
And you're talking about everybody from the utilities on down to somebody like me.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah. Look, you're going to have storage if you want it. I'm not saying, but
I'm waiting.
yeah, you're waiting. But there's a lot of folks who can't afford it. Actually, out in the some of the wild areas outside of Turlock, people can't afford it. So we have to, there's going to be a balance. Now, it's going to come. We're going to get more storage. California certainly is stimulating it. There are some new technologies. Quite frankly, there's a lot of old technologies which can be deployed. Now, it gets to the German model, right, which says if I raise my prices to 40 cents a kilowatt hour, yes, a whole lot of stuff passes through the screen, right? I can do a whole lot at 40 cents. But do we want to have that impact on the economy? The Germans have made a very conscious decision, and I'm not making a value judgment here. The Germans have made a very conscious decision that societally, their societal driver of being cleaner and greener overrules the economic drivers. In this country, at least historically, we haven't done that, right? We made sure that economic sense rules first, with then our social goals layered into that. Germans have just done the opposite. They said, socially, this is our decision. This is what we're doing. We're going to socialize all costs. And the economics of it, well, people will pay.
Towards the middle of your presentation, you talked about moving away from a kilowatt-hour charge for energy.
Yeah.
And you said that the entities, individuals associated with conservation aspects would be against that. Why would you give a damn how much energy I use if I'm not impacting anything?
Personally, I don't. But there are folks who believe, come from an orientation that says anything electric is bad. Right? I wish that wasn't the case. Not me personally. I think it's, remember I'm the guy.
Taking energy from the backside of my farm and running it into my shop with the air conditioner with the doors open. Who am I hurting?
You're not hurting anybody as far as I'm concerned, but there are those who believe that that's not a good use of energy. Again, I'm thrilled if you do it, right? Because I want to see those curves flatten out, right? Isn't that what we're all after? We want to see the curves flat. But unfortunately, that's not always the case.
I think what some of your most recent comments, especially about Germany, that you kind of stumbled into the question that I had. And I think in years past, it has been the practice for the United States utilities to think of economics. But really the current utility circumstances are being driven, in my mind, by policy. And second, by economics. We're given a policy that we need to meet, and then you guys go home and figure out how you're going to do it the best you can. Is that a proper perspective?
Yeah, yes and no. I mean, look, I believe that utilities are fundamentally economically logical. So if, in fact, the policy says, hey, we need to do X% in demand response and X% of energy efficiency, and I'm going to give you a return on that investment, there's an economic logic to it. It's not what I saw over in Germany 2 weeks ago, which was clearly driven by, here's our social policy. We're going to eat the cost no matter what it is. Now, there are policies which are driving various decisions in this country. But at the end of the day, I look at low natural gas as the #1 driver, right? Obviously, renewables to the extent that they are financially supported. Again, depressing prices. And let's face it, consumer demand. Have any of you seen an increase in demand in the last 4 years? I don't see any hands up. Oh, he's got one there. And where? Okay. But in most places, we haven't seen, in fact, we've seen a decline of 1 to 2%. Now, there are some exceptions. We do a lot of work up in North Dakota and the Bakken, all the oil fields. But for the most part, there's a lot of compression going on right now. And it's a challenge.
So your conversation, it just dawned on me. So about 5 years ago, I asked an expert, at what point does the value of renewables become cheaper than conservation efforts? And he said about 4 or 5 years. That was about 4 or 5 years ago.
I kind of like my fuel cell analogy. I think we still, look, a kilowatt hour not used is still a kilowatt hour not used, right? So it's kind of hard to argue against zero with something that has some kind of embedded cost. That's always the challenge with that argument. And again, I want you to be clear. I support all this technology and demand response. It takes everything to run this grid. And that's something that is forgotten in the equation. We need every possible tool that we have. If we're not building fossil generation, if we're closing nuclear plants, we're relying more and more on renewables, natural gas, and all those pieces. We need everything to work together. And that, to me, is the big challenge that the Germans are facing. I think it's the problem we're going to face all across the country. We can't rely on a sole source of power. We can't rely on a system that's not fully interactive. It's going to take everything we need to do. Now, the good news is we've been spending time and effort developing technologies, better power electronics, more analytical tools, more software to manage the grid better. And by the way, that's from my big grid all the way down to the distribution networks. More and more tools are out there. How many of you have Nest thermostats? Right? Now, if you didn't raise your hand, when you go back to utility, ask the folks that are in charge of this how many Nest thermostats are sitting in your service territory. You may be stunned to find out how many there are. And that's kind of the gateway drug to home energy management. And I say that with all the love in my heart. I'm not insinuating that it's bad. But all of these changes are going to continue to happen, making predictability and analytics that much more challenging for all of us. But other than that, I think I've probably blown through my time, right, Gary? All right, well, thank you all. Again, if you need to find me, Gabriel at WAPA.gov.